Okay, and just so you know, as well as the webinar, we will have some of the PowerPoints that we'll be able to share with you afterwards. So don't worry if you're trying to scribble down links or anything like that, we'll be able to circulate it. But Amanda?
Okay, thank you, Kate. Hi, I'm Amanda Waite and I'm the Development Officer at Burnage Library, which is nestled at the heart of the Burnage estate, built by Manchester Corporation in the 1920s and 30s. And alongside Kate Turner, my colleague, the last 2 years we've been working with local tenants and residents in Burnage to explore the stories behind the estates through our Burnage A Place Called Home project, which is funded by the National Lottery. The Heritage Lottery. So we've delved into the archives and done our research, but also really importantly, we've been able to learn so much about people's experiences of living on the estate. So with the help of our volunteers, a couple of them have joined us today, so it'd be great to hear from them. We've recorded some fantastic oral histories and participants have been really generous with their time and they've lent us photos and they've shared their memories of the area. So if you want to find out more about that, you can go to our website where we've got recordings and photos and stories and stuff. So last week we covered 100 years of affordable housing from the post-First World War Acts and their impact on Manchester's housing. And we focused on Burnage as a really important case study. And moved to the challenges facing Manchester today. And we looked at examples of contemporary projects addressing our acute housing needs. So if you want to catch the talks, we'll be sending out the link to last week's talk and this week's talk. And you can go to our website, which is www.burnagehome.co.uk. There's lots of information there. So, today we're delighted to welcome our three fantastic speakers and they're going to present their perspectives on building a community and how people transform their built environment into a place called home. We'll be hearing from Dr. Charlotte Wildman, who's Senior Lecturer in Modern British History at the University of Manchester, and she'll be drawing on her work on building communities in the new corporation suburbs. Charlotte kicked off our project with a series of workshops in different community settings around Burnage, so we're very lucky to have her do that. Next up, we've got Dr. Alison Ronan, who's the Research Fellow at the Manchester Centre for Public History and Heritage, and she'll be looking at the utopian experiment of the Burnage Garden Village, which has drawn a lot of interest. Ali's also a great friend of our project, and she supported us by doing walks around the garden village and coming and giving talks locally. So that's been great. And finally, bringing us up to the present is Jane Gant, who's the Strategic Director for the aptly named People and Places at Southway Housing Association, who now manage the Burnage, Kingsway and Green End estates as part of the transfer from Manchester City Council. So Jane's going to tell us, what the contemporary picture is around community building. So great, brilliant. So over to Kate now. She's going to share some of the images from our project just to sort of lead you into some of the work we've been doing.
Thank you, Amanda. Can everybody see my screen? Yeah?
Yeah.
Great, okay. So it's just, as Amanda said, I'm just going to show you a few images that we've collected throughout our project with a couple of stories about how in Burnage the built environment was changed by the community to suit the community. The Burnage estates were built throughout the 1920s and into the 30s. There were fantastic provisions, as we talked about last week, as John McCrory talked about last week, for maximising green space, light and airflow. But there was less provision given for community activity. In 1929, a garden society was founded. This was to support new residents moving to the area. As you'll probably know, Burnage gardens are vast and really lovely, but the tenants moving into these houses might or probably didn't have green space in their homes before moving to Burnage. So this is kind of an essential community organisation to help people to learn how to care for their gardens and to kind of share tools. But it wasn't until 1931 that a meeting was held to discuss the demand for social activities. The meeting was held by Councillor Simon at Green End with a group of mums to see whether they thought there was any demand in the area, and it was an overwhelming yes. And the meeting resulted in the founding of the Burnage Community Association. It was very much an association by the people for the people, and the earliest groups were decided by those who were part of the association. So the earliest sections were handicrafts and debate and literary societies, but it moved on later to have youth sections and a dramatic section. So you can see here some of the images from the earliest performances. The costumes are fantastic, and the stage setting is really, really lovely. They didn't have a premises at first, so a lot of the meetings were held in people's front rooms, and performances like these were held in Green End School. There were several homes for the association over the years, including Shawbrook Lodge, which is a vast property on Burnage Lane, which I'm sure you'll have seen if you know Burnage. It was built for an early industrialist. It's a fantastic property. It's now actually the church hall for St Bernard's Church. And there were several other venues for it, but in 1959, after a long series of fundraising initiatives and a lot of research done by the community association members into design, the Burnage Community Centre was built. Can you see that? My screen is not moving. There we go. The Burnage Community Centre, you can see in the top right. It's a really unusual design, but since starting this project, we've seen that there are several others in the area that are just like it. So we can see where the community association members got their ideas from. So having this building meant that the groups could really expand on what they were able to do, and the dramatic performances got better and better. And they continued to use the resources of the community. There was a local painter and decorator responsible for creating the stage scenery, and there was a costume department. A library volunteer, Carol, talked to us about this vividly yellow piece of material that she can remember was kept in the costume department for years, and she said if you look back over all the photographs, you'll see one year somebody's wearing it as a shirt, and the next year somebody's got it on as a scarf. And they also had variety shows, which sound really fun. They had singers, dancers, comedians, and the like. And the community centre is still used today. There's karate and yoga, and Burnage Good Neighbours use it for their lunch sessions. And then there's the Burnage Buddies, who you can see pictured in the bottom right. In addition to the community association and centre, there are of course churches, which were the heart of Burnage social activity. Here you can see the start of the Whit Walks from St Nicholas's Church. Some really lovely photographs here. And top right is a photograph from the 1930s. I think Charlotte will talk a little bit more about broader Whit Walks later on. There are Rose Queens in, I think, lots and lots of communities. We've probably got some retired Rose Queens here today. But in Burnage, there was also the Butterfly Guild, which was hosted every year in the grounds of the Duchess of York Hospital to raise funds. We spoke to a local person, Sylvia, recently, who can remember being the Rose Queen at the age of 12, and she said that she learnt to walk and talk properly. So there we go. Scouts were really lucky in Burnage because there was a man called Robert Garside who kept these fantastic journals about the first Burnage Scouts. They start in the 1930s and they go right up until the 50s. There's at least 60 volumes, and he's got all the details of all the trips that they went on, and there's loads of photographs. They're held at the Central Library in Manchester, so when possible, I'd really advise going and having a look at those. We also have a significant guides group, the oldest in Manchester now, which started in a kitchen in Burnage. One of my favourite of the Burnage community stories is the Burnage Young Wives. It was a group of mums who met at the school gates and decided that actually they wanted to socialise and they wanted to learn. So they started this group where they would have speakers come and talk to them. They'd have authors come to talk about new books, and they learnt lots of arts and crafts skills. and as Doreen said to us, it was something to do instead of talking about the washing up. And finally, libraries. So there was actually a provision made in the earliest plans for the estate for a library. You can see it in this image here. It was supposed to be between Arbour Avenue and Irwood Road. But in 1934, the corporation led a programme of slum clearance, and the space was used to build new houses for displaced families. Several other locations were scoped, and there was a travelling library, as you can see here. I really love this photograph. But it wasn't until 1974 when our fantastic Burnage Library on Burnage Lane was built, and that's where our project has been based. There's a couple of links here. As I say, I will send this PowerPoint out to you, but it's the link to our website where you can see lots more of these stories and listen to some of the oral histories that we've collected. And we were also on All FM recently, and I've got the link there which you can listen into. But I'll hand over to Charlotte, who'll talk more about building communities across Manchester suburbs. Thank you, Charlotte.
Hello, everyone. So I need to, am I a co-host to share the screen?
Yeah.
So am I?
Yeah, you should be able to share the screen
I can't see where to do it.
Is it the green button at the bottom?
Oh, sorry, yes, no, it is, sorry. So thank you very much for inviting me, and it does seem like a lifetime ago since the project started, and it was a real pleasure to be part of it. So my research looks a lot at kind of working class domesticity, particularly in the northwest. My first book was about urban redevelopment in the 20s and 30s, and my current project is what goes on behind closed doors, so working on working class family life, particularly through the lens of crime records as well. So I wanted just to kind of talk a little bit about the kind of challenges of building a community in a new suburb, but also, you know, what I think has been great, one of the many things that's great about this project is that it gives us new insights that kind of challenge a lot of the assumptions historians have made about the community and the new suburbs. So to give you a kind of sense of what the main historical scholarship says, this book, Leisure, Vendor and Poverty, is one of the ones that really influenced me, particularly when I was finding my feet really as a historian. And it's focused on Salford and Manchester and working class culture, but what it tells us really is how much of an older style of community, how integral it was to people's leisure, sociability, family structures. And as you can see from the front cover, quite often around, it's quite often spatialised. So on the streets, pub corners, those kind of micro spaces that were really central to how people built their networks and relied on a very tight-knit community relationships. So people would often be in these older working class areas for generations. And so one of the kind of challenges really of slum clearance and suburbanisation is that it destroys or breaks up these very, very closely knit communities. And historians started to kind of get interested in the processes of urbanisation in the 1980s. And Madeleine McKenna's research on Liverpool is quite typical in emphasising a kind of sterility of the new suburbs, of the lack of community. So you can see here, she says Liverpool interwar municipal estates were bleak utilitarian dormitories lacking the facilities that were required to foster a new community. And this was quite typical in the way that historians saw the new suburbs as kind of facilitating isolation and loneliness. So women's historians, there's an important book by a women's historian called Judy Giles, and she draws attention to the challenges that women experienced, particularly being removed often from family, from all their kind of support networks. And one of the examples that's often given is a new category of mental illness that emerged called suburban neurosis. And it was used to explain the kind of mental ill health that some women experienced because they found life in the new suburbs so challenging and isolating. And certainly, as I'm sure that you've come across before, the most important thing for a lot of people was improved living standards. And I really like this extract. It's part of an oral history interview by Madeleine McKenna on one of the first inhabitants in a Liverpool estate. And she talks about, all my life, so we came here, I had to go down the yard to the toilet. You can imagine the difference it made having the toilet next to your bedroom, especially in winter. You felt like the queen. And I think what's important about this kind of research is interviewing women who draw around the experiences that were transformatory to them. So, having your own inside toilet, making you feel like the queen, it's important to hear women's stories, I think, because it draws attention to the importance of these kind of everyday transformations. At the same time, there's a sense that the new suburbs fostered a new kind of privatised kind of domesticity. And straight away, really, from the 1930s, there was a kind of acknowledgement that the building community, as it was then known, the types of older style community, was a challenge. There's lots of kind of enthusiasm about the physical changes of housing, but there's a kind of shift to a much more inward, privatised form of domesticity. So again, the Madeleine McKenna interview here, she talks about how people were neighbourly, but they liked to keep to themselves. My next door neighbour came from the rough part of town, where they kept their doors open all the time. It didn't like me keeping my door closed, but you had to. You didn't want people getting to know your business, to familiar life. And I like this extract because it kind of exposes a tension, really. And historians have often presumed that working class inhabitants disliked the suburbs because they missed that kind of everyday interaction, that kind of street-based culture. This interview shows actually, for a lot of women, being able to close the door on your neighbours was really quite welcome. And I think one of the important kind of issues or challenges around building community really is that the process of moving from close-knit working class urban communities to the new suburbs meant that it wasn't a kind of homogenous group that were arriving in the new suburbs, and there were a lot of potential tensions around class differences as well, because the suburbs are designed for middle class, upper working class, but bringing people from different parts of the city to one suburb could often bring out kind of tensions. So this is a big study done by Mass Observation, which was a social research movement that started up in the 1930s. And what I like about this study is that it kind of brings out a lot of the keeping up with the Downs' tensions, really, particularly around the newer inhabitants who were seen to be not quite as responsible or house proud. So it says here, it is not so well kept now, fences are down and children playing in the streets make a row, proper slum it's getting. And when we first arrived, it was very nice, but it's deteriorating. And we've got all sorts now here from other parts. It used to be quite a different kind of neighbourhood. So there's kind of different groups of people rubbing up against each other and kind of bringing out these tensions about whether or not the houses are being kept properly. And one of the kind of conclusions that the study drew to was about this apparent lack of community. So it says, when people were asked whether they liked the neighbourhood or not, less than 1 person in 100 mentioned any form of activities involving cooperation with their fellow citizens. And it says the idea of living in a neighbourhood thus appears virtually to have no connection or responsibility for its good environment in the mind of the average house owner. There was no single reference to political activities, only a few to forms of social, cultural and religious activity. So it's really, really emphasising this lack of community facilities, this lack of opportunity for people to come together and to develop relationships with their neighbours. Many people are passive-minded, it says. So it's quite critical, I think, of the lack of community in the suburbs, but also the lack of engagement on the part of citizens. And as Kate was just showing, you know, this isn't reflective of what happened in Burnage. And I think kind of the presumption around the lack of community in suburbs has probably been because historians have looked at certain suburbs over others. I also think it's been a reflection of trying to look for a reason for perceived failures around certain suburbs. So it's a much more mixed picture than I think historians have been keen to acknowledge. And so if you look at some more recent oral history, and I think that there has been a shift in the way that people narrate the past, there's a much more strongly emphasis on how community was built. So this is an example from Wythenshawe, and it was a kind of a collection of oral history taken around Wythenshawe Park. And the interviewer is talking about, you know, it's all farmland, farms everywhere, but in quite, you know, really strong terms. She's really keen to emphasise, but the community was very strong. And she mentions that she could have named everyone on the first road that she lives on, which is quite different to a lot of the oral histories that were taken in previous generations. And here she's talking about the whip processions, and particularly the involvement of the Italians in the whip processions. As Kate mentioned before, they're really important as a focal point for community, and particularly a kind of episodic or temporary shared identity that was based around religious difference. So it wasn't Manchester, unlike Glasgow or Liverpool, it wasn't a particularly sectarian city at all. But one thing I've tried to argue in the work I've done before is that because of slum clearance and suburbanisation, things like the whip processions become much more important as a marker or a facilitator of community identity. And Manchester city centre becomes a really key site for this performance of community, this performance of shared identity. This is because you've got the old working class areas have been disrupted, everyone's had to move often quite far away from each other. So this is a way of kind of demonstrating a form of shared identity. And I think something that interests me is the idea that community might look different in the new suburbs than how it looked in the old working class urban areas. So perhaps people might not necessarily acknowledge it as community, but actually the nature and the form of community might change. And I've put a link here to some archival film footage of some of the whip processions in Manchester city centre, and what you'll see is there are often very elaborate costumes. People invested a huge amount personally but also financially in participating in the whip procession, and they were really key as a kind of demonstration of belonging and of shared identity. So they've become increasingly important in Manchester in the context of urban redevelopment and suburbanisation. And I think it's looking at these different sites helps us understand how community was developed and brought about in the new suburb, or as a result of new suburb building. So just to talk a little bit about more about community building, I think I was really struck when I was thinking about this talk. So I live not far away from Burnage at all. So I live right next to this park, Fog Lane Park, and I was quite surprised when I found out that Fog Lane Park was only bought by Manchester Council in 1926, and I think you just always presume that Manchester's parks are Victorian, but I was really struck that Manchester was building parks like this at the same time as it was investing in housing in this area. And I think parks are a good example of how the spatialised or kind of locational experience of community building changed in this period. And actually looking at where groups came together in the new suburbs. It's not street corners so much, but it might well be parks. And if you kind of think about the way people talk about childhood experiences, who lived in Burnage, things like parks are really, really crucial to where they developed friendships, but also playing sports. It's also very important for kind of developing associational forms of leisure for adults as well. So I think it helps us think about a shift facilitated by suburbanisation and slum clearance, away from that street-based, close-knit, I would say claustrophobic working class networks and communities, to a kind of a very different model of what community meant, where the home was an important kind of privatised space for people, and that was often very, very welcome. It emphasised smallish nuclear families, home-based, taking pride in new consumer durables, decoration and furniture. But actually, where people developed forms of community was in very, very different spaces than it had been before suburbanisation. And I think, as we saw with the examples from Kate, it's very much about kind of organised forms of leisure, associations. And I was also thinking about celebrations as well, things like street parties for particular events and that kind of thing. So I think there is an important shift in how community was facilitated and displayed, but I think it's wrong to say that the suburbs lacked community. So I think the project here has shown us some really important examples of how community perhaps mattered more than ever before.
Thank you. Brilliant.
Nice. Charlotte. Yes, we will send out Charlotte's PowerPoint, as I say, so you can see that footage that she's linked to, which will be really interesting, I'm sure. And now, Ali, Ronan, if you're happy to share your screen or hear about the garden village.
Okay, let's see what I can do here. Okay. Is that okay? Yeah?
Lovely.
Okay, hi. Well, thank you very much, Charlotte. That was just fantastic. And it's made me think about all kinds of things about Burnage, which predates really the suburbs that you're talking about. I'm a kind of late developing historian. It wasn't my first job at all, so some of this is about my own particular interests. So I came to Burnage Garden Village really through the people, because I was researching women, particularly during the First World War, that were anti-war or were involved in kind of socialist and suffragist activity. So I began to piece together that a number of people on the village were involved in activity that I was interested in. And this led me then to look at Burnage in much more detail, really, than I thought I would. And of course, then I became completely not obsessed by it, but really interested in what was going on. So I think what we have to think about Burnage Garden Village is it was an ideal. It grew out of the garden suburb movement, the sort of arts and crafts. It happened at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, when people in Manchester were very agitated, really, about the poor standard of housing. It was very obvious that people were living in substandard housing. And what you have here is, and I know that there was municipal housing that predates Burnage, obviously, in Ancoats, but for me, this is an attempt to experiment with some housing that is outside the municipal fund, really. So it was raised, the money was raised through a loan stock, which again, I think is quite interesting. And again, I came to that through seeing that one of the women I was researching, Margaret Ashton, who's the first councillor, was one of the people that bought into the loan stock. I think we have to also think that this was, I'm not saying it was a capitalist venture and there's some altruism, but certainly people were getting a good return for their money. Sometimes they're called the 5% or the 10% philanthropists, because they would be getting a very good return. So many of the initial loan stockholders who were raising money to buy the land and to build the houses were significant Manchester people, including professors, reformers like Margaret Ashton. You have a number of the professors whose wives were very involved in the suffrage movement as well. You had businessmen like Hans Reynolds and other philanthropists who would be well known in the kind of liberal milieu of Manchester at the time. And I think what Charlotte's talk made me think about was that there is already, for me in Burnage, in Burnage Garden Village, there's already a network going on between these people who are raising the money to try this out. So it is about, I want to talk about networks at a local level, but I think at this stage I'm also very interested in the kind of networks that are about, in Manchester at that time, the interest in housing, the fact that you had councillors involved in this project, people who were on the housing committees. So there's for me, there's a kind of way in which these ideals are beginning to spread out through that kind of network of people who are not working class by and large, not probably higher middle class and professional people, but they had a big effect, I think, on what was going on. And I'd really like to talk about that perhaps after this. So the layout was loosely designed to an arts and crafts principle. There were a number of people who put in designs, and I think we had some things that John McCurry did fantastically last week about looking at some of those designs. It seems to me that what was happening at that time, and I think there was an act passed which influenced this in the early 20th century, about trying to get away from the lines of terraced housing that had been built. So what you have here, you have an estate laid out in the manner of a garden suburb, you know, calling up the ideas from Ebenezer Howard and the garden suburb movement. So you had characteristic hedging, you had front gardens, you had grass verges, you had trees. And it's also built in a circle, which means that people that it has a kind of central focal point, which is the bowling green, the tennis courts, and the community centre, or the village hall that they called it then. So one of the things I really like about the village is there's a man called T.R. Marr, who had come down from Edinburgh in the early 20th century. He'd been working with Patrick Geddes, who was a town planner and quite an idealistic kind of progressive thinker. And Marr had come to work for the Cooperative Society, and before long he became involved in housing. He set up an organisation. I'll just see if I can find out. Sorry, I've got some notes here. He set out something which was about. I haven't got it, but it's about the unwholesome dwellings. It's a kind of very long name that doesn't really trip off the tongue. But Marr really was the prime mover and shaker for the Garden Village movement. And the thing I like about him is that he lived on the village, so he was completely dedicated to that. Martin Dodge and I have tried very hard to find a picture of Marr, but it's been almost impossible. So if anyone has one, I'd love to see it. So here's T.R. Marr, who lived in the village and would have known a lot of the people that I'm going to talk about. So, oh yes, this is what he called the Citizens Association for the Improvement of Unwholesome Dwellings and the Surroundings of the People. I think it trips off the tongue very nicely. And he had written a very influential book about housing conditions in Manchester and Salford. And he was really, I think, one of the driving forces between the ways in which the council began to look at housing in the early 20th century. So again, asking people in the village what they remember about it, I really like this. It was really a socialist ideal. It was to be a community of everyone loving you and being kind. And we had somebody talking about this idea, which really, I think, builds on the stuff that Charlotte was talking about. In fact, these people did buy into this village. Everybody had to buy shares in it, and they were part of the cooperative of the village. They were part of actually maintaining it and thinking about how life was lived in the village. So this is what one of the residents said in the 1950s about the beginnings. In the first place, we've sacked the landlord. It doesn't mean we don't pay rent, but not as much as we should be if we had a landlord. Just think for a moment, 140 rents could be increased by, say, an average of 10 shillings a week. That would be £70 a week extra income. If only we had the decency to let an experienced landlord run the business for himself. Just think what a landlord could do with an extra £70 a week. In time, he could buy himself a peerage. So I think that begins to tell you something about some of the ideas that were going on in the village at the time. So the first person that I really got to know, if you like, on the village was Annie Brickhill. And Annie Brickhill was a teacher. She'd been a former teacher. She obviously gave up when she married her husband, George Brickhill, who was also a teacher. But she was the secretary of the Women's Freedom League. So the Women's Freedom League was a break-off society from the Pankhurst's Women's Social and Political Union, set up by Mrs. Despard in 1908. And it really was trying to be more democratically run. And we know that Mrs. Despard actually came to the village and talked to the branch of the Women's Freedom League. And to me, this is really quite, quite extraordinary. There are only 2 branches in Manchester, and this is one of them. So we also had suffragists and socialists, all these women: May Dent, 22, Clara Doughty, 26 North Avenue, Maud Dean, and probably many other women that I haven't come across, were members of the Women's Freedom League, but we also know that they were socialists as well, and that they were involved in the Independent Labour Party. I know that Maud Dean particularly stood as a local councillor after Margaret Ashton resigned in the early 20s. Although she was unsuccessful, she stood as a Labour councillor. So these women, and Tony can talk a lot more about this, but these women were very involved in the milk boycott of 1916, where the Women's Freedom League organised a national boycott of milk to protest about the inflated wartime prices. And we know that they held meetings in Burnage. We had a wonderful reenactment of one of their meetings a few years ago. So this is really, to me, this is something about how the community would have been working together. There was, people would have known each other, people would have talked over the fence, people were neighbours, and these were important things that were going on, particularly during the First World War. Am I okay for time, Amanda? Yeah. So then we've got some quite high-flying socialists on the living on the village. Particular Edgar Whiteley. Edgar Whiteley, who lived at number 5 East Avenue, was the editor for quite a long time of the Labour Leader. And the Labour Leader was one of the radical papers in the early 20th century, a socialist paper. And during the First World War, his presses were quite often raided, and the paper was impounded if it was writing articles that were critical of the war in any way. And what I've discovered as well is that some of the husbands of the women were involved in typesetting and printing, but what I don't know is if they were involved in the National Labour Press, which Edgar Whiteley was involved in. So whether that was another connection, a lot of this needs to be more carefully researched. At number 21 East Avenue was a man called Dick Wallhead, who was a very prominent ILP man in Manchester at the time. He'd come from Wilmslow, where his younger daughter, Kathleen, has written a bit of a memoir about that time, saying that in Wilmslow, the family was one of 8 socialists. I like that they could actually name the socialists in Wilmslow at the beginning of the 20th century, and that they were quite often mocked because they were vegetarians and anti-vivisectionists, and they would not be involved in any of the celebrations about the Boer War and things like that. So they moved to the village, and Muriel Wallhead becomes very involved in the ILP. She's a suffrage woman as well, very friendly with Ellen Wilkinson. And I always like the idea that Ellen Wilkinson, you know, one of the first women Labour MPs, would have walked up and down East Avenue to see her friend Muriel Wallhead. So that always makes me feel rather cheered, I think. There was a time in the war when Muriel Wallhead's brother was in prison as a conscientious objector. Her fiance was also in prison as a conscientious objector, and her father was in prison for speaking out against the war in Wales, and he was imprisoned as well. So I don't quite know what poor Muriel made of that. So here we have Edgar Whiteley and Dick Wallhead and the Labour Leader. You can look at the Labour Leader. Manchester Central Library has copies for most of the war years, and also the Working Class Movement Library. There were a number of conscientious objectors as well in the First World War, and I also know from the Green Books there was also a number of people that went to war. So I think this must have been quite an interesting time for people about how they might have talked about the fact that there were young men going off to war, and there were young men who refused to fight. So that might have been quite an interesting time to be on the village, where everybody would have known each other very well. So Harold Wild and Frederick Crowther were both COs. And again, thanks to Tony Hunter for her discovery in Fred's work at Platt Hall during the First World War, which means that he didn't really come up as a CO in the Pierce Register because he didn't go to prison, rather like Harold Wild, who was exempt because he had a bad leg. But Harold Wild has left a diary which can be accessed online, really. I think if you Google Harold Wild, he's written a very interesting diary about the anti-war movement in Manchester during the First World War. Richard Wallhead, Muriel's brother, was also a CO, and I've been looking at some of the research I've done on the Wakefield prison at that time, where they, in the 1918, the government decided to put all the men there who were called themselves absolutists, which meant they wouldn't do any work for the war effort, and Richard Wallhead was one of them. It didn't last very long because the absolutists wouldn't do anything in Wakefield jail either, and I think it was a bit of anarchy going on there, so that experiment didn't last very long either.
We have about 1 minute, Ali, sorry. Yeah.
So again, this is what the man Treslan Popham Crowther wrote. I live in a crazy place called the Garden Village. It's one of the few left intact after the spurt of enthusiasm before 1914. The place is actually run by a committee of 12, all tenants. These 12 citizens actually control the whole business of running the estate, and for a paltry fee of £25 per annum. No, not 25 each, but 25 the lot. Crazy, but what about expenses? Not even a cigarette or an acid drop adorns the table at the weekly and monthly committee meetings. By now, you're convinced that there's something in it. Sensible men don't work for nothing, you say. That's the point. We are not sensible. We're crazy. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was lovely. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, Ali.
Fantastic images.
Great.
And now to Jane to bring us to the present day.
Hi, can I just check everybody can hear me, because I've had a few volume issues. Loud and clear? Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Thank you, Alison. That was really, really fascinating. Okay, so I'm very much looking at things. Oh, my slideshow, I've forgotten, you see. Just give me 1 moment and I will try and share my screen. I forgot about that. Share screen. Is that there now?
Yeah, lovely.
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so I'm very much looking at this through the lens of a housing provider, really. And as a bit of background for people who don't know, if I can move my slides at the same time. Ah, I can. Wonderful. I've done it. I've been more worried about that than anything else today. As a bit of background, Southway Housing Trust, we were formed in 2007. We were part of Manchester City Council's stock divestment programme. And at that time, we took responsibility for just under 6,000 homes across 6 wards in South Manchester. 2,000 of those homes are in Burnage, and our remit was really to deliver on a set of promises that had been agreed with tenants who transferred, and those included a £120 million home and environmental improvement programme. So our initial focus in the early years was very much about giving everybody up-to-date and modern facilities. As an example, when we took over the homes, many still had bare brick kitchens and lacked up-to-date electrics and heating, and many were also very poorly insulated with insecure windows and doors as well. So it was a very key focus for us, but it's fair to say that we also spent a lot of time working with communities, looking to improve green spaces, parking availability. We planted a lot of trees and wildflowers, and we wanted to make spaces available for people within their neighbourhoods, places where people could play and carry out activities. So I think one of the most important things to sort of note about Southway, and I'll see Karen is very, very clear about this, is we're very much the steward of the homes we manage. We're protecting them really as an asset for our communities now, but also in the future. And I think that's particularly important now, given the really, really significant lack of affordable housing that there is available in the city, and particularly in South Manchester. And also the crisis in homelessness that I'm sure did get picked up last week. And I think those two things really juxtapose the focus that there's been on high value city living with wealth and growth being very important. And I think we saw that in the Utopia programme over the last few weeks. I don't know how many of you had watched that, but I think it's fair to say I'd really, really hoped for a bit more of a balanced view of housing and quality in housing and affordability in housing. So that's sort of the background to Southway and how we came about. But we've never been about just bricks and mortar, although obviously our main function is to provide good quality homes that we manage well. But we've always been really, really proud, immensely proud, I would say, of our role as a community landlord. We're community based and we want to work with our tenants and residents and with other stakeholders really to deliver services that people want or need to be able to live well and healthily, and really importantly have equal access to opportunities. So some early examples of our work, and I've tried to focus everything that I'm talking about today on Burnage as far as possible, so that it's got that neighbourhood focus. So our ongoing partnership with the Friends of Burnage Library and Manchester City Council Library Services, which meant that the library was saved in 2013, and it continues really successfully. Annually, it has more visitors than the library did when it was managed through the local authority. So it's been a fantastic success story. Another thing I wanted to highlight was Westcroft Community Centre. So this was a housing office when we took over the homes from Manchester City Council, and led by volunteers, we've turned it into a really vibrant community hub with lots of different services being delivered from it. So those are just a couple of examples of some of the work we've done in places, working with community groups and with individuals. But I wanted to bring us forward really, and talk about this year, and in talking about this year, really have a bit of a focus on COVID-19, because I think it's something that we can't get away from, particularly when we're looking to the future, and we're looking at community and we're looking at place. So in March 2020, the Southway Board agreed its new 5-year future strategy, and our vision in that strategy is for thriving communities. So we set that in March 2020. Our aim was that there would be good quality neighbourhoods where people looked out for each other and where there was a strong network of committed and skilled community organisations. As things stood at that time, we were committed to investing at least 1 million every year into communities through health and wellbeing, age-friendly advice services, work and skills, volunteering, and our all-important community partnerships. And that isn't to say, when I say that and I talk about our investment, that is Southway's. That's about our communities. We use the assets that are available and we work with people and organisations. And whoever is best placed to deliver services in local areas should deliver them. We're there as a support. Sometimes we take the lead responsibility, other times we don't, acknowledging that we're not always the best at things. But I think it's fair to say that COVID-19 has really highlighted the need for strong community, strong partnerships and places where people can live well in a way that we hadn't expected it to happen. And I think the other massive thing for us that we've learned is it's shone a light on just how unequal our society actually is, and how important those locally based services are, and how important it is that we look out for each other as well, both as individuals and as organisations, I think. So I've been thinking about, you know, what makes a community thrive? Is it people? Is it the community? Is it community groups? Is it the natural resources? Is it facilities? Is it stakeholders like Southway? And I think we all probably conclude in the end that no one thing and no one person can make something thrive. I really strongly believe that a place is formed by its people. And then the trees and branches grow around them. And I'm using that nature analogy really because Burnage has so much green space as well. I think it's fair to say one of the big shocks we got through COVID was that we really didn't understand the level of disadvantage and inequality in our areas. And I just wanted to give some really stark, sobering facts. So we knew before COVID in Burnage, as an example, that 46% of children were assessed to be in poverty, that 21% of Burnage households were living below the poverty line after they'd paid for their fuel costs, that working age benefits were higher in Burnage than the Manchester average, and that incapacity benefit claims were higher in Burnage as well. And these are all higher than the national average and the Manchester average, it has to be said. And we also know that people who are on low incomes pay what's called a poverty premium. So on average, you're more likely to pay an extra £1,100 a year for goods and services because you're on a low income. And that's particularly across things like food, fuel, utilities. So there were challenges there already, with strong communities, with a lot of fantastic people, but now we expect more challenges is the reality. We're in a recession, unemployment's rising, poverty and in-work poverty is increasing, opportunities are decreasing, and the ability to do things with others is really affected by restrictions. I will just very briefly mention the potential of a no-deal Brexit to add to the issues that we're encountering at the moment. And then there's things about isolation and loneliness, mental health and well-being, separation from families and friends. So I appreciate that those are all rather difficult statistics, but I want to focus on the positive now. So how do we learn from that? How do we take those things forward? How do we focus on people and place and community? And what do we do more of that we've learned through this period over the last 6 months? And there are a few things I really just thought were worth saying. I think we all talk more. You know, Southway has a weekly check and chat with our older residents who are lonely and isolated. We also talk to people who are unable to get out and about. Online and telephone support has become more normal to reduce isolation. Zoom and Skype for families and work. WhatsApp and other local groups sprang up to support people. People were more neighbourly. People took care of each other. And so practically moving forward, and I'm talking about this partly from a housing provider perspective, but also from a community perspective, I would say, we need to find out now what's important to people in the here and now and how we best plan for the future. You know, we're looking at an 18-month plan in terms of COVID-19 and possible time period for recovery. And then there's our new future after that as well. So I wanted to talk about a series of we wills that I think promote place and promote community and promote living in the best way we can. So things in partnerships, we can increase our work with health, the police, local community partners and other housing associations. And we have started doing these things. We can bring our services together more and use them as a platform to develop more joint working. We can be more successful together. We can give local people confidence in our services, respond to antisocial behaviour quickly and effectively, work with others to make sure our areas are safe and sustainable. We've got to acknowledge food and fuel poverty as a massive issue. We have 5 food pantry clubs, Quids in. 2 of these are in Burnage, and we've had a 60% rise in membership since COVID. And we know that there's significantly more to do around food and fuel poverty. People can only live well if they've got enough food in their bellies and they're living in warm homes. We've also reckoned the impact of digital exclusion. We recognised that quite early on in COVID. You know, there were families struggling with one phone trying to do homework and schoolwork during the lockdown. There's issues around fuel poverty and not accessing good quality and low price services if you can't get online. There's also unemployment and the recession, so we've got to find new ways to support people to get skills and move into work. I think we need to innovate with local businesses, train people online, respond to changes in the economy by focusing all our work and skills on those areas of business that are going to grow over the next few years. I did want to mention we're holding our first virtual jobs fair actually in a couple of weeks. So if people do know people who want to come, please advise them. There's lots of information on our website as well and on our social media pages. And I think we need to work together in partnership. We really need to work with and get to know better all the local mutual aid and charitable groups, some of which were formed actually during the COVID lockdown. And we need to find ways to do things together but remotely, and that includes in places and spaces as well. You know, we've got beautiful and fantastic resources in our green spaces and parks so that people can go out and meet other people. And I think it's really important that we continue to use those and celebrate within those. And perhaps there's some things we can do as we move into the winter around Christmas and perhaps Halloween and other events. I like the idea of carol singing on some greens. We can still do those things. And I think finally, I just really wanted to say, we can learn and grow together and build new ways of being in a place, and that be responsive to the times that we're living in. And I think in the end we'll find new ways to create place, and that will be in our homes as well as our public spaces and in the way we deliver our services. And I think just back to Ali's point, I think it was Mrs. Luby talking about the need to care. I think it's really, really important that we all care and respect each other, and that's how we create really great places with really great people, I think. So that's me done. So I will stop sharing now. I haven't shown you the photos actually. I did say I thought that I would probably forget. They're all in Burnage, and they're all about things that have happened around Burnage as well. So I will just show you them all before I turn this off. And they're just some examples of community and place and space. And I can't stop sharing. Sorry, right. Oh, PowerPoint.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. It's really relevant. And actually, we've just had a question here from Judith. Obviously, you were just talking about COVID-19 and kind of the bigger impact that will have on the community. But do our other speakers have any thoughts about opportunities that might come out of this? Charlotte or Ali, any thoughts?
Well, I was really heartened by what you were saying, Jane. I mean, obviously, we're in a terrible situation with COVID, but you know, I was a community worker in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, and I think there's so much scope now for people to come together. You know, I used to walk to Didsbury, go past that your community centre off Kingsway.
Yeah, Westcroft, yeah.
And I always wondered what was going on there. I think in times of crisis, sounds awful, but I think people do take stock and reach out to each other. That's what I can hope. And we can begin to think about how hard life is for some people, and to be kind to each other. And I think what researching Burnage has done for me has made me think about the fact that people also want to meet people that they share ideas with, as well as people that they don't. So I think there's something about those community groups which are really important as well. And how
Absolutely.
you get people together.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think I said early on, we're a housing provider. We don't have all the answers. We're really committed to working with people and with groups. But there is so much that has risen up through COVID that wasn't there before, and keeping that momentum and that energy and making sure there's a support infrastructure for those groups so that they can carry on doing what they're doing as well.
And I think at the moment, I don't know, sorry, I don't want to hog this, but I think everybody gets not here probably, but you know, get involved in things like making people better qualified to get a job, or talking about technology and that kind of thing. But I actually think it's some of the very simple things that people want, like some educational opportunities, the chance to get together and talk about things, or coffee mornings, you know, those kind of things that if we're not careful, they vanish because it's all about employability and blah, blah.
Yeah, I think there has to be
that's not important.
No, I think there's a balance, isn't there? There are so many different things that are important, you know. A lot of our tenants and residents are older, so, you know, work and skills for a younger age group, whilst it's very important to us, and it is important for our older tenants as well, isn't our only focus, you know. We're very clear about, you know, volunteering and being part of a community, and, you know, really making sure that people have got opportunity. I think work and skills is a really challenging one. I know Ursula's just popped up on the thread actually, so I'll stop talking.
Yeah, I was just going to say we have run over a little bit, but if Ursula would just like to say something, and then we'll close this. Here we go. Hello, Ursula. Oh, hang on. Are you there? You're still muted, I think, Ursula. There we go.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. So I actually live in Burnage. I've lived in Burnage since 2002. When I first came here, my flat was owned by the council. It was then taken over by Southway, as Jane was saying, in 2007. And to be fair, really, I have seen a massive improvement in the area. I mean, Southway, they have really done a fantastic job overall. But yes, just to sort of basically summarize what people were saying, because yes, I mean, the focus was very much on improving the houses from a certain dilapidated state, and even things like, you know, fencing and stuff like that. And so I think it's only quite a recent thing to really focus, you know, in historical terms speaking, very recent thing to get back on the focus onto the community. But what I wanted to say was that I have noticed, and this is just a fact, that we are definitely culturally more diverse now.
Yeah.
100%. And so this is something that I've not really, because I mean, I was really, when Charlotte was speaking about the wheat walks, and I thought that was just, you know, beautiful, and what's happened to them, you know, why don't they, but of course, obviously we just have to take into account that, you know, it's just, things have just changed. So these things don't really happen as such anymore. So now we have, you know, more like maybe sort of mothers groups getting together from different cultures and things like that, and cultural dynamics that have changed. Thank you.
It's interesting to have a Burnage resident's perspective. Thank you. If there aren't any more questions, then I think we'll say thank you to all of our speakers. It's been really interesting, and I hope that everybody who's joined has got something out of this. If you do have any questions that crop up, I'll be sending an email out with all of the link to the webinars and PowerPoints, and you can reply to that, and we'll see what we can do. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you, everybody, and really nice to see familiar faces and new faces. Great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.